Hi, I'm Helen Bauer, and this is the Heart of Hospice podcast. The Heart of Hospice podcast is your source for compassionate and informative discussions about hospice and end-of-life care. I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with over 15 years of experience. Whether you're a caregiver, someone with a serious illness, or you simply need to know more about hospice care, this podcast is for you. Join me as we explore all the aspects of hospice, from the details of caregiving to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of end-of-life journeys. For more resources and to connect with me, visit theheartofhospice.com and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Keep listening for today's episode.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
The Heart of Hospice podcast is being sponsored by The Death Deck, featuring the End of Life Deck. The End of Life Deck is used by many healthcare providers as a casual way to help start conversations about end-of-life wishes. It helps people communicate what matters most to them. To learn more about the EOL deck, visit thedeathdeck.com. This episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast is being brought to you by GrandPad. This holiday season, give the gift of connection with GrandPad. GrandPad is the all-in-one tablet designed specifically for seniors. This Christmas, give the gift that keeps on giving, a world where no senior feels lonely or isolated. GrandPad is more than a gift, it's a gateway to cherished family memories. To learn more about GrandPad, visit grandpad.net/THOH. GrandPad, bringing families together.
My guest, Allison Applebaum, is sharing the story of how she supported her dad's end-of-life journey as he dealt with Lewy Body Disease and what quality of life really meant to him. Dr. Allison Applebaum is a caregiving scientist, writer, researcher, speaker, and advocate. She's a professor in the Brookdale Department of Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine, and she's the director of the Center for Caregiving at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She was previously the founding director of the Caregivers Clinic at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, the first program of its kind in the U.S. to provide comprehensive psychosocial care to family members and friends of patients who are in the caregiving role. Allison's program of research focuses on the development and dissemination of supportive services for family caregivers. She's also the author of Stand By Me, a guide to navigating modern, meaningful caregiving. Allison's most important role to date is that of daughter to composer and musician Stanley Applebaum. Allison's dad, Stanley Applebaum, was a composer, and he helped write some amazing popular songs that you're going to recognize. One of those was the song Stand By Me, and of course, everybody's got those lyrics in their head somewhere. In our conversation, Allison describes her journey and her dad's journey with Lewy Body Disease and how that affected them. She calls them, the two of them, partners in care. And she describes the unique symptoms and the effects that the Lewy Body Disease had on her and her dad. You'll hear Allison talk about her desire to maintain her dad's quality of life and how she went to great lengths to give him as normal a life as possible. She also discusses their decision not to have a DNR and why it was so important to her dad and to her. So There is a lot to unpack here. This is one of the best conversations we've ever had. Here's my conversation with Dr. Allison Applebaum. Allison, welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast. I'm so glad to have you with me.
Thank you so much, Helen, for having me.
We're going to have a great conversation today, but we're going to start out with a question just so my listeners can get to know you a little bit. I didn't send you this one, so sorry about that. So here's your question. When you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, this is an easy one. I wanted to be a professional ballet dancer.
Oh, wow. I thought you were going to say, oh, I knew I wanted to be a doctor, or I knew I wanted to be.
No, I was pursuing that career pretty hard and until my early 20s, actually. Yeah. So I like to say I sort of had a first career as a ballet dancer.
I like that. So when you were a kid, you knew you wanted to do that and you pursued it.
Yeah. I had my debut at age 7 at City Center in New York City in a production put on by at the time it was the Dallas Fort Worth Ballet, actually. So I was starting young. I came from a family of musicians and artists, so it was a natural pursuit of mine, and was very, very passionate about that being my career for a long time.
Well, speaking of your family and their pursuit of music and all things in the arts, introduce me to your dad. Tell me about your dad.
Yeah. My dad, Stanley Applebaum, was my best friend. He was an incredibly prolific musician, a composer, arranger, orchestrator, and conductor. He was working with many of the great artists of the 50s and 60s, including Benny King and Neil Sedaka, Connie Francis, Brian Hyland, just to name 4 of many, and was responsible for many hit records. And he's likely best known these days for his arrangement for Benny King's Stand By Me. So everyone knows that piece of music, and so everyone listening knows that there's an incredible string line and an incredible string section in the middle of that piece, which was my dad's composition. So for any of you who've heard Stand By Me, in some ways you've already met Stan Applebaum.
I love that. So I guarantee you every one of my listeners has those lyrics going through their head right now.
Good.
Absolutely.
Good.
Everybody knows that song. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
So you and your dad had a kind of intense experience towards the end of his life. Can you tell me about that journey? Share your dad's story.
Sure. So you might also be thinking, well, wait a minute, how old is Allison and how old was her father if he was writing all this music in the 50s? So my dad had me when he was nearly 60 years old. I'll start out with that. And there was basically a 60-year age difference between us as partners in care, which is important, I think, when I reflect on my caregiving journey. And my dad lived until his late 80s with really only minor medical problems. But then he had a series of events and hospitalizations. And during one of them, he developed delirium, which is a confused or altered mental state, which is very common in older adults when they're in the hospital. And he was given a medication he actually should not have been given, unfortunately, to control the delirium. And that medication put him into a coma. And there was one silver lining of this coma experience, and that was that it gave his team of doctors the hint that he might have Lewy Body Disease, which is a progressive neurodegenerative disease that leads to fluctuations in autonomic functioning and consciousness. In my dad, he would have sudden drops in blood pressure and temperature to near hypothermia levels, and he would hallucinate. And he'd hallucinate anywhere from a few minutes to a few hours. Occasionally, it would be an entire day. And at one point in our journey, it was an entire week. And we never knew how long the hallucinations would last. And I personally experienced each one of them as a mini death. My dad's diagnosis of Lewy Body Disease came officially in 2013. My mother, who was 22 years younger than he and someone we believed to be in good health, unfortunately died very suddenly a year into his diagnosis, which left me to navigate taking care of him in a setting of acute grief and trauma. Thankfully, with a great team of neurologists, my dad's Lewy Body Disease eventually was very well controlled. And while he never recovered physically from what unfortunately was about a 12-month period in and out of hospitals and nursing homes where he became completely deconditioned, when he was not ill with a urinary tract infection or when he was not hallucinating for other reasons, my dad retained his short-term and long-term memory, his zest for life, his creativity. And so in so many ways, we were living this perpetual Groundhog Day, bouncing back and forth from periods when he would be disoriented and hallucinating. And usually that was the result of a urinary tract infection or other sort of illness. Or at baseline, while he was bedbound, he was fully himself and able to engage in life and communicate and make the most despite the limitations he faced. And that was sort of our life from, I would say, about 2015 until the last 6 months of his life, where he was able to really live as fully as possible. And I say that, and I can talk a little bit about what that meant for my dad. And I had a lot of help at that point in help in giving him quality of life, the way that he defined it. But ultimately, he was able to really regain years of life. And eventually what happened is that he actually, he died in 2019, in February 2019. And he had, during the prior year, had a handful of infections. He had pneumonia at one point. And I believe he actually was developing a malignancy on his leg. And I think there were a variety of other things that were happening, medically speaking, that really weakened his entire body. And so eventually, I don't believe that he died of Lewy Body Disease. He had many other medical processes underway.
There's a lot to unpack when it comes to your caregiving story. So I want to touch on a couple of things. I've never had a Lewy Body caregiver on before, somebody who's cared for a loved one with Lewy Body. And it's such a valuable topic because that kind of caregiving, I think, holds its own special challenges and grief. Lewy body is really unpredictable. It doesn't show up the same way in each patient. It's hard to diagnose. And I think a lot of people struggle with it. And any type of neurological disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, all those different types of neurodiseases, I think the caregivers become more isolated inside that caregiving journey because of the behaviors and the symptoms that their loved one often presents. So I think this is such a valuable conversation. The other thing I want to point out is you were actually second in line to be your dad's caregiver. Your mother was his primary caregiver, I'm assuming, before she died.
Not so much. So my mother was helping to take care of my dad. My mother, there's many reasons why we step into the role of a quote unquote primary caregiver. And it sometimes is because you are the spouse or the daughter, but sometimes it's because of your capacity and your ability and maybe the flexibility you have. Right. My mother was a concert pianist, and she was at the height of her pianistic career at the time that my dad was diagnosed. And I work in healthcare. And so when my dad's health started to really decline, it was a team effort between my mom and myself. And while on paper, while she was alive, she was his healthcare proxy and power of attorney, the day-to-day, in terms of navigating healthcare emergencies, that was my responsibility. My mother did a beautiful job in managing his medications. They lived together, so she was the day-to-day, making sure he took his medications on time, making sure he was eating, all of that. And I was stopping home every day, at least once a day, if not twice. And so this was really a team effort, but certainly after her death, it was all on me, and it was all on me in the setting of trauma and grief because her death was so unexpected, and of course, intense grief all around. Yeah. So the caregiving experience dramatically shifted after her death, but I certainly was in that role beforehand.
When your mom died, even inside the grief, right? Because it's a very reflective, inwardly facing experience. Did you realize and have a thought, well, holy shit, I am it now? Yeah,
for sure. There was definitely that holy shit.
Yeah.
the weight of the responsibility was profound. And yet I realized, in some ways, reflecting back on it now, my mother died 10 years ago in 2014, that taking care of my dad, that drive within me to take care of him. I mean, at the time he was bedbound, he was full assist, he needed assistance with all activities of daily living. It gave me great purpose to be able to take care of him, because he was grieving so heavily as well. Of course, he had never expected his wife to predecease him. So we were all traumatized and we were all grieving. And yes, it was holy shit. And another piece to acknowledge is that I was doing this all behind the scenes while public facing, leading our nation's first psychosocial care program for family caregivers at any cancer center in this country. And so there was this very strong connection. Of course, I was caregiving in my personal and professional lives, and I had no break from it in any way.
So many caregivers do that. We keep our personal lives.
I'm not unique in this way. Yeah.
No. But I think it's really great for my listeners to hear that. So many of us, I mean, especially people like you and I, we're working in the healthcare system. What do they tell you about when you enter the door where there's a patient or someone that you're going to take care of? You drop whatever's in your personal life and you walk in without it. You don't carry that in, you don't share it, you don't show it, because that's not your role. That's not your patients and their caregivers' roles to listen to your personal problems, right? But you can't truly set that down. Those things are a part of who we are as human beings.
Yeah.
So here you are telling your story now, and it has incredible value for somebody who is an advocate and an educator, a professor, a writer, to be able to say, all of this happened to me. All of this happened to me. Maybe it's happening to you. There's some incredible lessons in there. Yeah.
And then at the same time, it would have been a disservice to my patients from 2011 to 2019 to disclose my personal caregiving journey at that time. That was not the time for me to share, because my role is to take care of them, not for them to take care of me. But I do think there's value now in sharing my story.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So I want to talk about your dad's quality of life, because your dad was a little unique when this particular diagnosis. The creative drive for a lot of folks that have a neurological degenerative disease, they often lose that artistic ability, the creative ability, which is a very grievous thing all by itself, right? Because there's so much joy, and a lot of times it's caught up in their identity. It's very much a part of their identity. Yeah. Was your dad, because he had these periods of lucidity, was he aware of his decline and exactly what this looked like?
Fully aware and so frustrated by it. This was a man who would have wanted to live, in his words, to 103, and he had many more pieces of music to write, and he had many more walks by the boardwalk to take, and many more drinks of Stewart's root beer to sip. This was a man who was not done growing and living and experiencing life. And it really frustrated him that he would have and they got longer and longer, the periods of lucidity actually, but then he would have an infection or something would happen and he would get weakened again. And it was tremendously frustrating to him. When he was hallucinating, he was not necessarily aware that he was hallucinating, in the fact that it was so real to him. He didn't have insight. It was, baby doll, there's 3 men standing at the foot of my bed, and he was terrified. Unfortunately, also, I should say, one of the terrible things about Lewy body disease hallucinations, and this is by virtue of where the disease is in the brain and the amygdala, they're predominantly negatively toned. So transparently, I would have loved for my father to hallucinate going to Hawaii, or hallucinate conducting the New York Philharmonic. That would have been an incredible hallucination. Right. But it was usually, the theme was usually attack. And there were usually 3 men standing by the edge of his bed. And the other feature of the hallucinations that was so troubling is that the characters wouldn't speak. And so they would be silent. And in one point, and I know I wrote about this in the book, one of the most devastating moments, and this touches on what you shared earlier, Helen, which is that Lewy body disease, it presents differently in every person. It's very erratic, and it can be very, very painful. for family caregivers to witness. And
Yes.
my dad had hallucinated for an entire day, me sitting at the edge of his bed silent. And
So
the reality,
you were the hallucination.
I was the hallucination. And I remember I came home from work one day, and the home health aide who was there with my dad, I came home and my dad, I got to the bed and I gave him a hug and kiss, and he like turned away in anger. And the thing is that my dad and I had the most deliciously warm, beautiful relationship. And so that was maybe the first time in our entire relationship he had done that. And I spoke to the aide, and he had said that he had been hallucinating me all day. And my dad had thought that I had sat there silently. And that was a very, very painful experience, because it meant that I needed to repair a relationship that was broken outside of the context of my own lived reality.
Yeah.
And I think that piece is so difficult for caregivers of patients with Lewy body disease, because we don't experience the hallucinations. We cannot see and sense what our loved ones, our care partners are experiencing. I certainly would always have him try to describe it to me, and afterwards he would remember them and he would tell me about them. But when he was in it, it was hard to make him realize it was a hallucination.
Right. Trying to talk someone out of that hallucination.
You can't.
No, it's
You
their
can't.
reality.
Can't.
He must
Yeah.
have been so hurt
Yeah.
and
That one
angry.
time, yeah.
From
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. What a challenge as a caregiver to have to repair basically a fight that you never had, something that never
Right,
happened.
exactly,
But for him, it was very
exactly.
real, and the repair
very
needed to
real.
happen. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just another way that grief is this multifaceted, crazy experience.
Exactly.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. We're going to pause for just a minute. My guest has more to share.
The Death Deck has created a new tool they call the End of Life Deck, or EOL Deck. The EOL Deck can be used by families, caregivers, and healthcare providers to help facilitate conversations about end-of-life wishes. Using multiple choice and open-ended questions, the EOL Deck has a casual tone that makes starting conversations about what matters most a little easier. Here's hospice nurse Helen Bauer from Hospice Navigation Services sharing the value of the EOL Deck.
The EOL Deck jumpstarts the conversations we all need to have with finesse, compassion, and honesty. It treats end-of-life discussions with thoughtfulness and respect. Every end-of-life worker should have a deck.
To learn more about the EOL Deck and to purchase this helpful conversation starter, just visit thedeathdeck.com. This episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast is being brought to you by GrandPad. This holiday season, give the gift of connection with GrandPad, the perfect way to keep your older loved ones close, even when you're far apart. GrandPad is the all-in-one tablet designed specifically for seniors, making it easier than ever to share holiday cheer across generations. With secure, simple video calling and photo sharing, you can virtually join in on decorating the tree or watch as your little ones open their presents, no matter the distance. Spread joy throughout the year with GrandPad's user-friendly interface, allowing seniors to enjoy music, games, photos, as well as emails from family. No need to worry about Wi-Fi setup. GrandPad comes with 4G LTE cellular service included. This Christmas, give the gift that keeps on giving, a world where no senior feels lonely or isolated. With GrandPad, you're not just giving a device, you're giving the warmth of family connection. Make this holiday season unforgettable. To learn more about GrandPad, visit grandpad.net/THOH or call 1-888-904-4723 today to order your GrandPad. It's more than a gift, it's a gateway to cherished family moments. GrandPad, bringing families together.
Your dad retained his creative abilities. He composed music.
He did.
And engaged with music. How did you support that and encourage him in that?
I love this question because I think that often there's an assumption when we hear about what does quality of life mean, quality of life means being able to get out of bed on your own, to be able to walk on your own, to be able to travel, to be able to see the world, to be able to do X, Y, and Z significant things that require physical independence. And for my dad, and this is such a powerful reflection of his attitude, is that he was so frustrated with his physical limitations, and yet he wasn't going to allow them to hold him back from being creative. And so that meant anything from when he had the energy to do so, to get into his wheelchair and sit at the piano, or get out of the wheelchair to the piano bench and sit at the piano for as long as he had the stamina to do so. It meant that he would be in bed at times when he didn't have the energy. He would dictate to friends of mine or myself who can write music, melodies he was thinking of or ideas he had for songs. Rarely would there be a week that it would go by when I wouldn't come home, and the home health aides kept a log, a notebook where we had my dad's vital signs. They were taking it 3 times a day to track, to see if any infections were coming on. And often in the notebook between vital signs, there would be a poem or a story that my dad would have the aides dictate, that he would dictate to the aides, they would write down. My dad wrote a lot of children's stories and poetry. And so his mind was always working. And so he, despite maybe not being able to physically get out of bed on his own and be independent in that way, he was driven to continue to create and make the most of every day, whatever that could mean. Ways that I helped him, of course, number one, of course, is actually instituting a very strong team of home health aides, which was a whole journey for us that I spent a whole chapter on, because I knew that I physically could not take care of him on my own, and that physically I would not be able to give him as much independence as he deserved and was capable of. And so I had a wonderful team eventually of home health aides assisting him. It ranged, secondly, some simple things I did, like my dad really enjoyed reading the New York Times, but he had, because of Lewy Body Disease and the neurological and the neurodegenerative piece of it, his vision was really, really waning. And so, number one, there's no way with his tremulous fingers could he hold a newspaper, but number two, there's no way he could actually read the small print on a newspaper. And so what I would do is I would find articles primarily from the Science Times of the New York Times, and I would print them out in like size 32 font, and I would put tape on the edges of the top right corner of the piece of paper so that my dad could sit in bed on his own, read on his own, and turn the page on his own. That, for example, allowed him to feel a sense of independence in his thought and intellect. We would always have classical music playing on in the background, and just listening to music would lead him to talk about the composer we would be hearing, how the composer's arrangements would compare with the Stan Applebaum arrangement, and what was similar and what was different. I made sure that despite his physical limitations, he was still able to remain engaged with the part of himself that is a musician, was always going to be a musician, was always going to be a creative, was always going to be an artist until the day he took his last breath.
With these neurodegenerative disorders, there's so much of people's identity that gets peeled away. I think of it like the rose in Beauty and the Beast. Each petal falls away. They're losing something as they go. So for you to provide your dad with support and modifications that would help him enjoy those things, you were reinforcing his identity. And for him, that was quality of life. So pain is what the patient says it is. Quality of life is what the patient says it is as well. So maybe he didn't want to get out and kick a ball or walk around the block. But for him, enjoyment of music, maintenance of his intellect, to be able to read like that. And for any of my listeners who don't know, a 32 font is huge. So to have a newspaper article like that printed up with a little bit of structure to the page, right, so it's not flimsy, that's really an amazing thing. It sounds small, But that's there are OTs listening to this podcast that think you're awesome right now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I remember my colleagues at work would, I would be doing this at work, which possibly I shouldn't have been doing.
Probably not.
But
yeah.
they would probably not. But, I would be printing this out and I think they would think I was crazy, but this was always from my dad. The other thing, just thinking about quality of life, is my dad and I had a most incredible relationship. It was very open and we talked about every topic. And so it was natural to us to continue to dialogue around what does quality of life mean. And so this was a conversation that we had again and again and again, from the beginning of our journey as partners in care until his last week of life. And for him, quality of life meant being able to sit out. There was a terrace at the apartment that he was living in, to sit outside on the terrace and feel the sunshine on his skin. That was quality of life. Being able to sit with me and have conversation was quality of life. Being able to see his grandson was quality of life. Again, it was a different quality of life than he had 5 years prior, but it was still worthy and valuable.
Well, isn't that why those conversations are never a one and done? When you talk about advanced care planning, you don't just have that conversation and it's set in stone. I absolutely love the way you call yourselves partners in care. I love that. As a team, I think that's so important. So when your dad couldn't make his own decisions, I'm assuming you were his healthcare proxy after your mother died. Did you agree with all your dad's choices for his healthcare?
I did. And it's, it's important to acknowledge that, no decision's ever made in a vacuum. And every decision has a context and a family dynamic. But my dad's decisions were very, very well informed. And we talked through them at length. So my dad, number one, despite his age, and I do write about ageism in my book because that was something that we certainly faced, despite being a man in his 90s, this was a man who wanted to live at least to 103. And this was a man who never retired and was, writing music for the New York Pops Orchestra in his 80s. This was somebody who was not done living and growing. And so he had no real desire to just say, all right, I'm done, I'm going to die. And so that translated into him choosing to not have a DNR order. And the first time we talked about, we talked about this, we had these conversations so many times I've lost count, but after my mother died, of course, we had to have the conversation again because I was stepping in formally to the role of healthcare proxy.
Right.
And what we had talked about, which was really important, is that he realized that in the prior 15 months, 24 months, had he been DNR, he would not have been sitting with me having that conversation. There are so many moments that, DNR status in many ways will inform the urgency of care delivered in an emergency room setting. And so we reflected on the events of the prior 15 months, and there's no way that he would have survived, because while he had never received resuscitation during that period, he had been given urgent antibiotics. He had been brought into the A1 bay of the emergency room, which is where, folks go if they want to keep them alive. And so he realized that he did not want to be DNR, and that he was wanting to keep allowing himself to go to the hospital should there be a need. Now, the big change that happened in terms of this, he never chose to be a DNR. So and we talked about this repeatedly. And again, and this is where the disease is so complicated with Lewy body disease, because when he was sick, he would get really sick. And by really sick, I mean he would be hallucinating, or he would be so disoriented he wasn't even communicative. But then 3 days later, after a course of antibiotics, for example, he would be fully present and 100% himself. And that was a very complicated situation because, of course, neither of us wanted him to live life in a state that he couldn't engage with life. And it was very, very unpredictable at times. What he did say, this was around 2018. So my mom died in 2014, so about 4 years of us. And within those 4 years, we had a handful of hospitalizations. 2014, 2015, 2016, and then less so. He had a period of maybe a year without a hospitalization. And then we had gone back. He got the flu, unfortunately, and which of course is very dangerous for older adults, especially with dehydration. And so we had brought him in. And I remember after that hospitalization, he said to me, "Baby doll, I don't like the hospital." And I said, "Okay, I don't like the hospital for you either." And we were able to, and it was a very unique program back then. In fact, now in 2024, I think these are going to become much more commonplace. So we were very blessed back then that he was actually enrolled in what was called the visiting doctors program through his hospital practice, where he was actually receiving telehealth care from his doctors at home, to the point that I remember this was within the year before he died. He came down with pneumonia, but they brought an X-ray machine to his apartment and he actually could stay at home. And I remember what a gift that was to him. And so he had made that decision, but there was a caveat with that decision. And the caveat was that he kept saying to me, "I'm not ready to go. I'm not ready to go." And so it was, "I want to stay home. I would prefer not to go to the hospital. But if the care that I need to keep me here cannot be delivered at home, then that, baby doll, is when you bring me to the hospital." And so I had his words in mind. I'll also say that for many reasons, I took a lot of videos of my dad and of me. And mostly that's because I wanted to treasure these moments forever and ever and have them documented. But the silver lining of doing so is that I had many of our conversations around advanced care planning documented. And those became particularly important for me towards the end of his life, because I was able to remind myself that I had been honoring his goals of care and his goals of life.
Yeah, you needed that reinforcement. Allison, I didn't ask you this. Are you an only child?
I'm not.
You want to tell me about your siblings and their involvement in the care of your dad?
Sure. I have one sibling, my brother, and he was incredibly helpful with assisting to get my dad to doctor's appointments. So he would help to drive my dad monthly when my dad had a suprapubic catheter that helped with urination and was helpful to prevent infections. And so my brother was really helpful in transportation for my dad. My brother was really helpful in dropping off groceries, and he did contribute financially. He was part of the care network, but he was not hands-on involved.
Got it. I wanted to bring that up because we talk a lot about assemble your village. If you're a caregiver, running a one-woman nursing home with a gentleman who is bedbound, regardless of how close you are, how much you're dedicated to doing it, it's a hard job. It's not a one-person thing.
No, it's not. And I like that phrase, the village. In my village, my brother was certainly involved in that village. And there's just like with my mother, there are a variety of reasons why those were the responsibilities my brother took on. He had just become a new father. He didn't live close to my father physically, and I worked in healthcare. So, there's a lot of reasons why it predominantly fell on me. But, my village was really filled with direct care workers and home health aides who took care of my dad. And originally it was maybe 6 or 8 hours a day. And towards the end of my dad's life, it was 24-hour care. And they were a village, not just of home health aides, but individuals who became friends to my dad and family to my dad, and were eventually very affected by my dad's death. We had 3 or 4 young gentlemen who took care of my dad. That was part of his request. I want the aides to be male. I wanted them to be, young men who are strong, and I needed them to be strong enough. My dad was full assist. He was 6'1". Well, he shrunk a little, but around 6'1". And,
but he was not a small guy.
He was not a small guy, and he was at least 150 pounds. And I needed somebody who could lift him, no problem, from bed to wheelchair, wheelchair to toilet, toilet to shower, et cetera. But I say that the village was in large part this group of home health aides, and they did a incredible job. It was not without challenge. I mean, not everyone was wonderful. I want to acknowledge it took a long time to find the group of home health aides. And I write about my journey with getting my dad onto Medicaid in my book because it was so complicated. But But once I established that village, it really was teamwork, and it was teamwork until the end.
Yeah.
I personally could not have done it on my own. There's no way I would have survived.
Right. Right. I think it's important to talk about the challenges of putting together a team like that, because I think a lot of caregivers find ways to manage it. They put a lot of themselves into it, and then they are gathering these different people in. But there are a lot of fits and starts with that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's hard to find people that are a good fit, that you can afford, that can work the hours, that have the skills and the strength. There's a lot that goes into that. So I think that's important to acknowledge that role of a caregiver as a team leader. Basically, you're in charge of the village and putting it together.
That's what I became. What I became.
Absolutely. So if you could have a do-over, is there anything that you would do differently in your caregiving with your dad?
If I could have a do-over, I don't think there's anything I would have done differently in taking care of him. I think what I would have done is given myself the grace of taking some time off from work to spend with him while he was really, really healthy. Early, but maybe like, I'm orienting to like 2015 or 2016 when he had regained his energy. And I wish I had given myself the gift of even just a few days here and there just to spend with him. It was back in the time when I couldn't work from home. And so I was ready, as my dad would say, like a chicken with its head cut off, back and forth from the hospital home, sometimes 3 times a day. And I wish I had given myself that gift. But in terms of taking care of him, there's nothing that I would have done differently. I think that, we all as caregivers have regrets. There's things that happened. He had one fall early on. This is long before my mom died that I was at home for, and I regret that happened. But ultimately, when I look back, I was performing a superhuman job and a Herculean effort, and there isn't anything I would do differently, looking back now.
I love that. I love that you're able to say, I don't have any regrets about that.
It was painful. And certainly I have, like every caregiver who's bereaved, I've gone through replaying moments, end of life, long before end of life, and what would this or that. And ultimately, everything happened the way that I think that it needed to happen and was going to happen for him and for me.
I think a lot of caregivers do the shoulda, coulda, woulda. You know, if we hadn't made this decision, things would have gone differently, would have moved in a different direction. It's a blessing to be able to look back and see where the good things were. Yeah, I think so. So the no DNR thing is a sticking point for a lot of people. It's controversial. Yeah, it's a super hard decision. I think end-of-life workers have a tendency to be a little contemptuous. Maybe that's too strong a word.
No, I actually think that's fair. And I will admit that I felt personally very judged.
So by the healthcare workers?
Correct. During many of my dad's hospitalizations, and especially the last one when he died.
Yeah. So you're you're a physician. Why do you have this elderly gentleman?
Yeah. So I want to be clear. I'm a clinical psychologist, a psycho-oncologist, and caregiving scientist. I have a PhD, not an MD, but I certainly have worked in healthcare for 15 years, and I'm very educated. So the question was like, why in the world would this highly educated woman who understands the frailty of her, at that time, 96-year-old father, be bringing him in, and he's not DNR? And I felt very judged. And, there were moments in our journey where we were questioned repeatedly about my dad's DNR status, and that was demoralizing. It was absolutely demoralizing because my dad made it very clear, and I made it very clear, and to be continually challenged and questioned then led me to think, well, what's wrong with us, right? There was something wrong with us.
Right, it made you question. So did they ask you, are you sure you want to do this? Do you understand what's happening? Do you see this? Yeah.
I remember during my dad's last hospitalization, he was in the ICU when I brought him in to the last time. And that was the sickest he ever was. And he eventually died 4 days later. But I remember representative from hospice came in to speak to me and was almost like tiptoeing around it. And I said, I know what's going on here. As a clinical psychologist, I work with thousands of families at end of life. This is what I do professionally. I know wool over my eyes. And what was so challenging, Helen, is that I had, before that hospitalization, I'm making up a number, I want to say it was something like 30 to 40 prior hospitalizations over 8 years, in which my dad was super sick, and 3 days later he was back to baseline and said, thank you so much for bringing me here.
Yeah.
And so I was acting based on our collective experience as partners in care, based on the last conversation. I can smile and laugh about it now, and I have this one recorded before I brought him to the hospital, or a week, maybe a few days before I could see things were happening. There were medical processes happening. And I said, Dad, what can I do to help you? And he said, bring me a pickled herring sandwich, which my dad was the son of a butcher. He grew up in a very Jewish family. And, to me, like, this was someone who just wanted to eat and enjoy life. Like, he was oriented. What I want to say is this was a man who was oriented. And so it was really painful to be continually questioned. And, my dad was well aware of what it meant to be DNR, as was I, and to be not DNR. We understood that.
Healthcare providers, especially people working in intensive care, CCU, ICU, end of life, we really say, it's one of those do as I say, not as I do, because we will say, oh, it's the patient's choice, it's the patient's right. But behind the scenes, we are absolutely judging these people and thinking that we would make a different decision because we know better. The fact of the matter is that patient and that caregiver, the person who becomes their partner in their care decisions towards the end of life, they are the experts in that person's life and their values.
Thank you for saying that, Helen. I really appreciate the way you just framed that, because it's something I often say as well. I often say that family caregivers are healthcare professionals' best friends. They're on the front lines. They understand the day-to-day, and they actually know what patients' values are. And I think there was this added layer. My dad was frail. My dad died a week before his 97th birthday. And so everyone saw his date of birth. It was 1922. And they make assumptions.
Right.
They don't know who that patient is, that he's not capable. And as I've written extensively about, I made great efforts to help healthcare professionals to know my dad so they could understand the context in which his decisions, as carried forward by me, were being made. I remember feeling, and I don't think that this was explicitly said to me, but it was conveyed to me that my dad was wasting space in the ICU.
Yeah, it was inconvenient for the healthcare system.
And it was very, very painful for me.
Yeah.
Because my dad at 96 and 9/10 was just as worthy of care at that moment as anyone else. It was very painful.
It's devaluing.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not worthy. It costs too much money. You're not valuable.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're winding down here. So I want to ask you, what advice would you offer to other caregivers who are supporting someone who has chosen not to have a DNR?
To continue to have repeated conversations, because again, I think those decisions need to be, the decision to remain not DNR should just be discussed at different points as illness unfolds and health and capacity unfolds. I think that, doing what I did, what was really helpful in terms of actually recording some of those conversations to remind myself at times when I felt questioned or challenged about the decisions I was conveying, that I was able to confirm and affirm that I was bringing my dad's voice into the room. It was not just Allison's voice, it was Stan Applebaum's voice. And so anything you can do to remind yourself that you are literally the proxy, you are the voice for that individual, is really, really important. And then I think it's important to have conversations with your care partner about should there be a need for resuscitation? Should it get to that point, what do they want? I mean, to be very clear about their goals.
Right.
And so let me be very clear with listeners. My dad did not want to be kept alive by machines. That was very clear in a living will he had written in the 1950s, so long before I stepped into the caregiving role for him. My dad didn't want to have, be kept alive with a tube down his throat. But again, he knew, much more importantly than he knew that if he had signed a DNR, that there were all sorts of other measures that would have never been taken.
Right.
And so I say this again because I think it's important to have repeated conversations. And so I knew that when my dad's heart eventually stopped, they had started resuscitation, and then they stopped resuscitation. I thankfully was able to get there, and he died with my arms around him. And that part also, I should say, was part of his goals of care. He believed that he would be held by the two women who loved him, me here and my mom there. So that was, to be honest with you, maybe he received a minute more of chest compressions, maybe 30 seconds more for me to get into the room. But ultimately my dad wasn't aware of that. He wasn't feeling that, but ultimately allowed us to have the end of life experience. And I see that too, because, and this is a controversial statement that I'm sure lots of people have feelings about, but the end of life experience is not just about the patient. It is about the family. And that's very, very important.
Absolutely
very,
true.
very important. There's also an assumption that that is made, that so many of the families I work with, and my dad and I grappled with this as well, work against, which is the assumption that it's better to die at home. There's so many healthcare professionals who assume that's the case, and it's a very personal decision. There were actually many reasons my dad didn't want to die at home. That's not why I brought him to the hospital. I brought him to the hospital like I brought him to the hospital any other time, but there's many reasons why patients may not want to die at home, and why dying in the hospital may be the right decision. And I also want to acknowledge that, because I also felt a little bit of judgment there. Like, why isn't your dad in hospice care at home right now? And because a week ago he was in the visiting doctor service doing just fine, But I think that's another piece too, that I think it's important to work against. And then one other piece you asked me, any guidance is find other caregivers and folks like myself who've been through it to help affirm you, because I think that it can be really challenging, and it's really hard to be questioned again and again by healthcare professionals. But ultimately, what I hope for all of you listening who may be in a similar situation is to, at some point, long after your care partner has died, to look back and say, I did what they wanted. I honored their wishes, their values, their goals of care, and their goals of life. And that is, I still obviously am grieving. It's 5 years later. It's still so painful. And yet I'm able to say that.
Allison, if you had to choose one single piece, what's your favorite piece of music that your dad composed?
Oh gosh, these are hard questions.
He was pretty prolific.
My dad was really prolific. I would say my favorite piece is This Magic Moment, which he wrote for the Drifters. And this magic moment opens with an incredible string line. So my dad was dubbed as the king of the strings. And because back in the 50s and 60s, they used to record songs the old-fashioned way in a recording studio with actually live musicians. And that would mean that you'd have to pay every musician in the room. But my dad was one of the most sought-after arrangers and orchestrators, because he figured out how to make the smallest number of musicians sound as big as possible. Meaning, if you were working with Stan Applebaum, it could be very cheap. So he could do it with the least number of musicians. And so my dad was just masterful at combining the cello and the viola and the violin and the bass in a way that maybe you didn't have 16, you had 8, and they sounded like 16. And so when I think about one of my favorite pieces of his, it's This Magic Moment. It's the opening of This Magic Moment, which is just so brilliant. And I think really showcases his creativity and his talent. But it's a hard question, because there's probably about 1,000 more.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Tell my listeners how to connect with you and how to buy your book, which is all about your caregiving experience.
Absolutely.
Stand By Me.
Exactly. So Stand By Me. Now you all know, you have an insight into why this is the title. Stand By Me, A Guide to Navigating Modern Meaningful Caregiving, was published by Simon Element of Simon & Schuster this past February of 2024. Available on Amazon. You could just Google Stand By Me, Allison Applebaum. If you Google Stand By Me, Applebaum, you're going to get my dad. So you need to do Stand By Me,
right.
Allison Applebaum. You'll get not Benny King's song. You'll get my book. You can find more about me on AllisonApplebaum.com, on Instagram, Dr. Allison Applebaum, and Twitter X at Doc Applebaum. And please feel free to reach out. I'm always open to speaking with listeners.
Thank you so much for this, Allison. This is one of the best conversations we ever had about caregiving. Some really great insights. Thank you for sharing your story.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Helen, for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Heart of Hospice podcast. Check out our sponsor in the show notes, and please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We would appreciate it if you would share this episode with your friends and family and anyone who needs to know more about hospice. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.